Morning. It is time to start. Could you please take your seats? I can't believe even the Sunshine State can have weather like this. I feel sorry for Laurence. He must feel like at home. Is it going to help you if I tell you that you were the best teacher in Newbold College? Okay, you don't say that to your teacher when you are in school, but since I left Newbold College a long time ago, I have right to say that he was really, for me, the best teacher in Newbold College. Okay, I'm not going to take more of his time. Let's pray and give him space. Dear Lord, thank you for your everlasting life, love and grace. Thank you for the gift of life, for opportunity to study your word. Help us with your Holy Spirit to know you better and learn more about you. Amen.
Well, good morning, everyone. So here we are again. On Monday we did Daniel 1. Yesterday we did Daniel 2. And so today we're doing Daniel 3. Now, I'm sure that most of us, even perhaps before we perhaps may have read Daniel 3 before we came today, would have been familiar with the storyline of Daniel 3. So just very quickly, let me just mention what I'm sure most of us already know, but it's just to set the scene as far as what do we find in Daniel chapter 3. Well, you remember in Daniel chapter 3, King Nebuchadnezzar sets up a great image. He demands that everybody of any consequence in the empire must come to where he's erected it on the plain of Dura outside Babylon. Everyone must bow down and worship this image. If people do not bow down and worship this image, then they will be thrown into a furnace. That is, it's a death penalty for not worshipping as they've been told to worship. Daniel's three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, are the only three who remain standing when everybody else bows down. They are thrown into the furnace, but they are delivered. So, you knew that already, didn't you? Most of you, and those of you who aren't admitting it. So that's the bare bones of the story, all right? So what we're going to do as we study it now is to put some flesh on those bones and see some of the significance of some details in the story that might not at first sight be obvious. So that's what we're going to do. To begin with, however, I'd like to make two preliminary observations about some elements in this chapter before we get into the flow of the story itself. And that is this, that here we are then at the beginning of Daniel chapter 3. And in Daniel 3 we have an image or a statue, and that isn't the first time in the book excuse me, that's not the first time in the book that we've seen an image or a statue. Where have we seen that before? Daniel chapter 2, the immediately preceding chapter. In fact, the two chapters use the same word to describe this statue or image, same word in the Aramaic. English Bibles, though, different English Bibles will translate it in different ways. But let's just have a look at where we were in chapter 2. I think the clicker's not working for some reason. Here we are. Okay. So here we're looking at what are called statues in Daniel 2. Okay, I think that's working. So this is from the version I'm using, the New Revised Standard. this is in chapter 2, this is where we were yesterday. You were looking, O king, and lo, there was a great statue. This statue was huge, its brilliance extraordinary. It was standing before you. Thank you. And its appearance was frightening. Just excuse me just for a moment, just to lubricate this. What we had in chapter 2, we have the statue. In chapter 3, this is where we are now, King Nebuchadnezzar made a golden statue whose height was 60 cubits, whose width was 6 cubits. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Now that statue that we saw yesterday was made up of multiple metals, wasn't it? The head of that image or statue in chapter 2 was made of gold. The one we have here in chapter 3 is made entirely of gold. So at the beginning, we see there must be some kind of connection between the statue or image of chapter 3 and that of chapter 2. What's important for us to see then, regardless of how the word that's used here is translated, whether it's translated as statue or image or whatever, it's clear in chapter 3 that what King Nebuchadnezzar builds is an object of worship. So that's important to see. Verses 5 to 6, he says to everybody, you are to fall down and worship the golden statue. Now, sometimes, of course, we think of statues or images as just being representations, but these are objects of worship. That's essential for us to see if we're getting to the heart of the meaning of Daniel chapter 3. You are to fall down and worship the golden statue that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be thrown into a furnace of blazing fire. So, whatever else Daniel 3 is about, it's about worship. All right? We'll come back to that. That's just a preliminary observation. There's something else about Daniel 3 which strikes any careful reader. You know, you begin at the beginning of Daniel 3, you work your way through to the end, and something should strike you. It's something that we might avoid or not really see, but one of the outstanding characteristics of Daniel 3 is the amount of repetition that there is in the chapter. Now, this is just a general hint to you. If you're reading a biblical story and you find repetition, that's when you should slow down and look at what is repeated, because that's the way the Bible underlines what is of greatest significance often in a story. It will repeat. And we have a great deal of repetition. Let's just go through and see some of it. So, verses 2 to 3. I've highlighted different kinds of repetition here. Then King Nebuchadnezzar sent for the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to assemble and come to the dedication of the statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So, what happens? So, the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces assembled for the dedication of the statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And when they were standing before the statue that Nebuchadnezzar had set up, you're beginning to see the repetition here? You see, if we were writing it, we might have written the first verse there, and at the beginning of verse 3, rather than repeating it all, we would have said, and it happened. All right? But Daniel repeats it. And also, again here, look at verse 27. And the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the king's counselors gathered together. Some more examples. Verse 5. When you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, drum, an entire musical ensemble, you are to fall down and worship the golden statue that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Well, that's clear enough, isn't it? But just in case you missed it, verse 7. Therefore, as soon as all the peoples had heard the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, drum, an entire musical ensemble, all the peoples, nations, and languages fell down and worshipped the golden statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Now, did you get it the second time? I hope you did, because let's try it a third time. Verse 10. You, O king, have made a decree that everyone who hears the sound of what? The horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, drum, an entire musical ensemble, shall fall down and worship the golden statue. So I hope by now that you've all got it. It's possible that one or two you have not quite woken up. So look at verse 15. Now, if you are ready when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, drum, an entire musical ensemble, to fall down and worship the statue that I have made. Now, when I said repetition, that was a bit of an underestimate, wasn't it? Now, the fact that we have repetition here, what's the purpose of this? Well, it serves this purpose. It serves the purpose, the repetition, of underlining the fact that precisely what is commanded is precisely what must happen. Now, we don't have time to look at this in detail, but you might remember when you go to the book of Exodus, God gives detailed instructions to the Israelites on how they are to build the sanctuary. You remember when God says, build me a sanctuary that I may dwell among you? He then gives precise details. Do A, B, C, and D. That's how you are to build it. Go through a lot of detail, and then we hear, and the Israelites did A, B, C, and D. So in Exodus, exactly what God commanded is exactly what the Israelites did in the building of the sanctuary. You've got the same kind of thing here. Remember one of the things we said that, yesterday about God being in control. This repetition is to challenge that and to say it's actually Nebuchadnezzar who wants to be in control. Precisely what Nebuchadnezzar commands is precisely what must happen. And that's one of the themes of the book. We'll see that later on, but it goes through into the prophecies as well. So this repetition builds up an expectation of absolute conformity. You must do this, you must do that, you must do this, you must do that. Absolute conformity is demanded. No minority rights here. This is precisely what must happen. So, in light of this, here you've got all the machinery of the Babylonian state brought forward to demand conformity. We can predict that there's going to be a conflict between faithful Jews and what the king demands. That's a principle that's going to be tested in this chapter. It's not the first time it's been tested, though, is it? Remember in chapter 1, we had the refusal to eat from the king's table. Here, it's moved up a few notches. This is a far more dangerous situation, but once again, it's a matter of will they obey God or will they obey the king? Will they give their utmost allegiance to God or not? So King Nebuchadnezzar builds an idol, an image made entirely of gold, and he demands that everybody must bow down to it. Now, we've already seen, chapter 2, there was an image, and in that image, we were told that Nebuchadnezzar was the head of gold, remember, as a representative of Babylon? You, O king, are the head of gold. Now he builds an idol, an image, made entirely of gold. There's an obvious connection between the two. So let me ask you a question. Is it that Nebuchadnezzar has not understood the dream of Daniel chapter 2, and he's gone ahead and done it? Or has Nebuchadnezzar understood the vision, and this is his challenge to God. Let's get a show of hands. How many of you feel that Nebuchadnezzar didn't really understand the interpretation of Daniel, the dream in Daniel chapter 2? Okay, we've got a faithful remnant of one or two who think that. How many of you think that he did understand it and this is his challenge to God? Okay, well, there's the majority. Now, I'm not going to decide who's right and wrong on that, but last week I was at Avondale giving a couple of presentations on the flood. And I think it's following me here. One thing is quite clear in this chapter, as we move through it, is that there is a confrontation here between Nebuchadnezzar and his claims and God and his claims. So we'll see how that unfolds. Right. Let's look at how the chapter opens up then. We're going to go through the sweep of this narrative now. In verse 1, we're told that King Nebuchadnezzar made a golden statue whose height was 60 cubits and whose width was 6 cubits. Those dimensions mean that it is 10 times as tall as it is wide. So this statue does not really look, it's not the same proportions as a human being, all right? It's elongated, but it's nevertheless a statue, presumably in some kind of human form. The dimensions, 60 by 6, these are typically Babylonian dimensions. You know, in our mathematical system, well, I should say that I shouldn't really talk too much about our mathematical system because maths was my worst subject at school. The only thing that I failed with, when I was at school, you could fail and then you could fail with distinction. And I failed with distinction in maths. But our mathematical system, being a decimal system, is on a base of 10. But in Babylon, their mathematical system was on a base of 60, a sexagesimal system. And I'm told there are some advantages in having a sexagesimal system, where the mathematical system is based on 60. So this is a typical, the figures are typically Babylonian. It's built by the king, and the fact that we talk about 60 and 6. So that should ring a bell, perhaps. When we come to Revelation, we have the lamb-like beast in the book of Revelation in chapter 13, and we're told that it deceives the inhabitants of earth, telling them to make an image for the beast that had been wounded by the sword and yet lived. This calls for wisdom. Let anyone with understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a person. Its number is 666. You see the connection between the dimensions of Nebuchadnezzar's image, 60 by 6, and the number of the beast, which is 666. The Nebuchadnezzar statue is a Babylonian statue. The beast is a Babylonian beast. And the echo of those figures, 60 by 6, 666, is one of those ways in which Daniel and Revelation come together. Now, this image which Nebuchadnezzar builds is an anticipation of the prophetic chapters. I've mentioned this before, that our reading of the prophecies can be enhanced if we spend time in the narratives. And here's an example of that. This becomes clear when we recognize that in the Old Testament, on a number of occasions, images that people worship, idols, were sometimes referred to as abominations. So let's have a look at some examples, well, just 2 or 3 examples. In 1 Kings 11, verses 5 and 7, this is talking about how Solomon drifted away from the worship of God. For Solomon followed Astarte, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. Now, Astarte is a goddess, Milcom is a god, and is referred to as abomination. Then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, and for Molech, the abomination of the Ammonites. These are the gods of the Ammonites, the Moabites, referred to here as abominations. Now, if we bear that in mind, we think of certain turn of phrase that we find in the book of Daniel, in the prophecies. So in Daniel 9, verse 27, and in their place shall be an abomination that desolates. And then also in chapter 11, they shall abolish the regular burnt offering and set up the abomination that makes desolate. So Daniel, in the prophecies, is using the same language as is used to describe pagan gods in a place like 1 Kings. This isn't the only place that abomination is mentioned, because I'm sure you'll remember in Matthew 24, the words of Christ himself, when you see the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place, as was spoken of by the prophet Daniel, and he's referring back to passages like the last two that we've looked at, let the reader understand, and then he goes on to explain the significance of that. So Daniel chapter 3 is an anticipation of this theme in the prophecies concerning the abomination of desolation. Why? Because Nebuchadnezzar raises an image which everyone must worship. The worshipping of images elsewhere in the Old Testament often referred to as the abomination of this and the abomination of that. So the prophecies pick up on the theme of Daniel 3 and expand on that as to what will happen in the future. So if we keep that in mind, when we get to those passages in the prophecies concerning the abomination of desolation, it would be a good idea to go back to Daniel 3 and ask ourselves, what light might Daniel 3 cast on those prophecies? Whatever the abomination of desolation is, when the book of Daniel talks about it, it's connected with apostate worship. That's what the abomination at base is. It's about apostate worship, the worship of false gods. So, the Jews who are present then have this test. They had a test in chapter 1. Would they eat food from the king's table? They decided no. They would not bow the knee. They would not engage in that kind of political compliance. Got a similar test here in Daniel chapter 3. Will these three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, will they bow to the image and show political allegiance to King Nebuchadnezzar? Now, of course, as you can see, politics and religion are very close together here, aren't they? Both Daniel 1 and in Daniel 3. You can't really make a clear distinction between politics and religion, either in chapter 1 or here in chapter 3. So the issues that we saw in Daniel 1, to some extent, are being repeated here in Daniel 3. Let's just look at how things move on here. And if we take a look at verses 8 to 12, just to see how things move on. Daniel 3, beginning in verse 8. Accordingly, at this time, certain... let me check. No, we don't. I'm sorry. So let me come back. I thought I had it there. Accordingly, at this time, certain Chaldeans came forward and denounced the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that everyone who hears, well, you know what they're going to hear, don't you? The sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, drum, an entire musical ensemble shall fall down and worship the golden statue. and whoever does not fall down and worship shall be thrown into a furnace of blazing fire. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These pay no heed to you, O king. They do not serve your gods, and they do not worship the golden statue that you have set up. So, out of all the people present, out of all the officials, the satraps, prefects, governors, and so on, all of the Babylonian civil service who are there on the plain of Jura, of all the captives who may be among them, it's only 3 Jews who remain upright, who remain faithful. Only these 3 Jews refuse. This is a graphic illustration of the biblical theme of the remnant. You know, the remnant theme runs through the Bible. One of the first examples, you hear it raining again, but one of the first examples was in the flood, okay, with Noah and his family. They are the remnant. And you get that theme running throughout the Old Testament into the New Testament too. So you can imagine everybody standing, hundreds, thousands, everybody bows down. It says when you hear the sound of the music, you're to bow down. I dare say some people were bowing down even before they heard the sound of the music. The heat of the furnace on their backs. Everybody bows down, but 3 remain standing. It's a graphic example of taking a stand for faith under tremendous peer pressure. And that's essentially the essence of the remnant. To stand for truth despite enormous peer pressure. Now, these 3 friends, we've got to ask ourselves, why are these 3 friends there in the first place? They're there in the first place because they are members of the satraps, prefects, governors, and so on. They are employed by the Babylonian Empire. So it isn't a matter that they refuse to do everything that King Nebuchadnezzar tells them to do. Clearly, if they're employed by the Babylonian Empire, they will do some things that King Nebuchadnezzar tells them to do, but, as we saw in chapter 1, there is a place where you must draw the line. And this is where they draw the line. So far, but no further. It's a question of priorities. Now, the principle that we see here in Daniel 3 is spelled out quite clearly, explicitly in the New Testament. We'll look at a couple of New Testament passages just to underline what's going on here. Peter, you remember in Acts, Peter and the apostles answered, "We must obey God rather than any human authority." And I dare say it was basically those kinds of words that were going through the heads of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We must obey God rather than any human authority. And then you recall that Jesus was challenged by the Pharisees. They brought him a coin, you remember? And he said to them, "Whose head is this and whose title?" They answered, "The emperor's." Then he said to them, "Give therefore to the emperor the things that are the emperor's, and to God the things that are God's." So on the plain of Jura that day, these 3 friends can say, well, we've been giving to the emperor, King Nebuchadnezzar, the things that are the emperor's. The problem now is that the emperor is claiming the prerogatives of God, and that we cannot follow. So, general principle. Rulers have authority in this world, but not absolute authority. When it conflicts with our commitment to God, that's where we must make a stand. Right. They go on to say something here. We won't read the top part of this, because Nebuchadnezzar's in furious rage when he knows that they won't obey. As you can see, we've got the hornpipe, lyre, trigon, harp, drum, and entire musical ensemble. Verse 17 is the critical bit here in this section. Here they are, heat of the furnace on their backs, death awaiting them, and they say at the bottom, "Our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire and out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods, and we will not worship the golden statue that you have set up." That's a tremendous statement of faith, isn't it? It's a recognition that the worst thing in life is not death. The worst thing in life is not death. The worst thing in life is to live a life with no principles. But if not, be it known, we will not bow down. There's something that we can learn from this as well. These young men who say this show tremendous character, don't they? And they're in a tremendous crisis of life and death. I think it's helpful to remember that character is not formed in a crisis. There is no time for character to be formed in a crisis. Character is revealed in a crisis. So where is character formed then? Character is formed, I think, in the everyday, humdrum existence. Every day of the week, every week of the year, we make decisions, we live our lives on matters of principle, when often not a great deal is at stake, but we get into the habit of living a life of principle, so that when a crisis hits, we don't have to think, now let me think, what do I do? Do I remain standing or do I bow down? Character is revealed in a crisis, and our characters are formed in our everyday, normal human activities. The penalty is fire. Now, people have died, in the Bible, people have died in fire for a number of reasons. I want to just explore fire a little bit. The one biblical example which is closest to what we have here is a statement we find in Jeremiah. And it says there, "On account of them, this curse shall be used by all the exiles from Judah in Babylon. The Lord make you like Zedekiah and Ahab, whom the king of Babylon roasted in the fire." If any of you are looking for a curse to use on people you know, this is a good one. Now, this Zedekiah and Ahab, this isn't King Zedekiah, it's not King Ahab. These are two characters we don't know anything about other than this verse. But their fate was that they died in fire by the king of Babylon. That is to say, the fate that awaits Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is no idle threat. It happens, and here's a couple of people who died in the flames. But when we read through the Old Testament, fire has got an interesting history in the Old Testament in particular. And I just want to explore that now, because I think it sheds light on what's going on. Before we move on to look specifically at that, I want to look at two contrasting verses in the Bible. We've got one in Deuteronomy 32, verse 39. Here's God talking about his power, and he says, "See now that I, even I, am he. There is no God besides me. I kill and I make alive, I wound and I heal, and no one can deliver from my hand." And no one can deliver from my hand. When we get to Daniel chapter 3, Nebuchadnezzar says something that makes us sit up and think. He says, "If you do not worship, you shall immediately be thrown into a furnace of blazing fire. And who is the God that will deliver you out of my hands?" See the contrast. God, no one can deliver from my hand, and Nebuchadnezzar, who is the God that would deliver you out of my hands? So it's as if Nebuchadnezzar here is challenging God's authority one more time. So, when it comes to fire, is it possible that the three friends will be rescued from the fire? Well, we have a precedent for that. You know, in Genesis chapter 22, where we have the binding or the sacrifice of Isaac. I'm sure we know the background to it, but you see there God tells him to take your son, offer him there as a burnt offering. And later on he cut the wood for the burnt offering. Abram took the wood of the burnt offering. He himself carried the fire. Isaac asks, where's the lamb for the burnt offering? God himself will provide the lamb for a burnt offering. And yet, at the very bottom, you notice the angel says, do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him. So Isaac escapes the fire, right? Isaac escapes the fire. Might Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego also escape the fire? So there are two possible solutions to this problem then. One of them might well be deliverance from fire, as with Isaac, but the other is possibly death, like Zedekiah and Ahab, whom the king of Babylon roasted in the fire. And the three friends recognize those two possibilities, don't they? Our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us, but if not, we won't serve. So those are the two possibilities that we think of, two possibilities that the friends think of. Now, one of the key words in Daniel chapter 3 is the word deliver. And I want to just take a look at this as we're considering this. Verse 15, who is the God that will deliver you out of my hands? Verse 17, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace of fire. Verse 28, blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him. Verse 29, there's no other God who's able to deliver in this way. So deliverance, one of the key themes of Daniel 3. Not just Daniel 3, it's a key term in Daniel 6, which I hope we'll get to by the end of the week. The king said to Daniel, this is the story of the lion's den, remember? May your God whom you faithfully serve deliver you. O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God whom you faithfully serve been able to deliver you from the lions? Verse 27, he delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. So, deliverance. We could use the word salvation. But deliverance is a theme in chapter 3. It's a theme in chapter 6. And this prepares the way for a significant theme in the prophecies in Daniel as well. For example, in Daniel 7, 25 to 26, the word deliver is not used, but that's what it amounts to. The saint shall be given into his power for a time, 2 times, and half a time. Then the court shall sit in judgment, and his dominion shall be taken away to be consumed and totally destroyed. That is, the saints will be delivered from the persecution of the little horn. The word isn't used, but that's what happens. Chapter 8, I saw the ram, no one could deliver from his hand. As a male goat ran at him with furious power, there was no one that could deliver the ram from his hand. So this is in the prophecies, theme of deliverance. And then the final one, at that time, Michael, the great prince, the protector of your people, shall arise. There shall be a time of anguish such as has never occurred since nations first came into existence. But at that time, your people shall be what? Your people shall be delivered, everyone who's found written in the book. So the theme of deliverance in the stories here, Daniel 3, Daniel 6, becomes a theme in the prophecies. So when we're in the prophecies, we would do well to refer back to the stories which give us some more detail on that deliverance. Now, the deliverance that happens isn't exactly the kind of deliverance we were expecting. Because what happens in Daniel 3, there's no biblical precedent for that at all. Isaac never entered the flames, did he? But he was rescued from the flames. But what happens with these three friends is that they are delivered within the flames. They enter the flames and they're delivered. Now that's quite amazing, that they are in the flames, they are in fire, but they're delivered. Now, I think there's more going on here than simply the fact that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were delivered within fire. Let's have a look at the significance of fire in other parts of the Old Testament. I hope you see what I mean, is that fire elsewhere is frequently a means by which God reveals himself. So let's have a look at that. Here we are in Exodus 3. We have Moses with his sheep. Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led his flock beyond the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of a bush. The angel of the Lord appeared to him. Fire is a means of divine revelation. He looked, and the bush was blazing, yet it was not consumed. Moses said, I must turn aside and look at this great sight and see why the bush is not burned up. And verse 4, you notice, begins, and the Lord saw, he spoke to him. So the fire in the burning bush is a means of God revealing himself to Moses. Another example, in Exodus 13, the Lord went in front of them in a pillar of cloud by day to lead them along the way, and in a pillar of what? Pillar of fire by night to give them light, so that they might travel by day and night. Neither the pillar of cloud by day nor the pillar of fire by night left its place in front of the people. So fire is a way in which God reveals himself. And we find that in Daniel, this time not in Daniel 3, but in Daniel chapter 7. We're in the prophecies here of Daniel 7. As I watched, thrones were set in place, and an ancient one, Ancient of Days, took his throne. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames. Its wheels were burning fire. A stream of fire issued and flowed out from his presence. In this vision, the fire means you are in the presence of God. Fire is the medium through which God reveals himself. And therefore, there is a great irony here. Nebuchadnezzar threw the servants of God into the flames, thinking it would destroy, that it would kill the servants of God. But instead, they meet God in the flames. Rather like Daniel 7, a fire issues forth from his throne. Fire is the presence of God. And there's that wonderful incident here, just to underline this, with Nebuchadnezzar. King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished, and he rose up quickly. And he said to his counselors, was it not 3 men that we threw bound into the fire? He's looking into the flames. They answered the king, true, O king. He replied, but I see 4 men unbound walking in the middle of the fire, and they are not hurt. And the 4th has the appearance of a god, or a son of the gods. Fire, when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego entered the flames, they entered the presence of God. So, as I said, there's nothing of this nature anywhere else in Scripture. There's something else about them. When they entered the flames, they were not burned, were they? No. And the burning bush, was that burned? No. Because fire is the presence of God. It can be destructive, it can be the presence of God. Just as the burning bush is not consumed, these three friends are not consumed, because in the fire they meet God. Now, this deliverance has an impact on Nebuchadnezzar. Let's have a look at how he responds. Nebuchadnezzar said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him. They disobeyed the king's command and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make a decree. Any people, nation, or language that utters blasphemy against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses laid in ruins." We've heard language like that before, haven't we? "For there is no other God who is able to deliver in this way." Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. Well, first of all, when Nebuchadnezzar says there's no other God who's able to deliver in this way, that's rather interesting, isn't it? Because what did he say back in verse 15? Who is the God who will be able to deliver you out of my hand? Well, this God, actually, Nebuchadnezzar. You notice something else here. We shouldn't think that Nebuchadnezzar has felt his heart strangely warmed and is requesting baptism at this point. Because he talks about, in the first line, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego." And then just under halfway, you notice, "Anybody who utters blasphemy against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego." So God remains the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He's not yet my God. And of course, if you are a polytheist, if you believe in many gods, you can always add one more. You can always add one more to the list. This one seems quite impressive. But of course, if you're a monotheist, if you believe there is only one God, you can't add any more, because there's only one. There's something else about what Nebuchadnezzar says here. At the beginning of the chapter, remember, he said, look, everybody's got to worship this God, and if you don't worship this God, you're going to die. Remember, that's how the chapter began, right? Right? How does the chapter end? Verse 29. Any people, nation, or language that utters blasphemy against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb and their houses laid in ruins. Recognize this God or you'll die. So the chapter begins, recognize this God or you'll die. It ends with recognize this God. It's a different God. Recognize this God or you'll die. He hasn't really learned very much. The chapter begins and ends with Nebuchadnezzar thinking that he can dictate how people worship. That's a very significant theme that's going to be picked up in the prophecies. A power that thinks it can challenge God and dictate how people worship. So, God has not yet finished with Nebuchadnezzar. And I haven't quite finished with you either this morning, because we've got a few minutes. So there's a topic here I'd like you to consider for a few minutes. Some discussion on this. So this is how I would summarize some of the significant things we've looked at this morning. In Daniel 3, King Nebuchadnezzar believes the following will achieve his aims. First, size. It's a colossal statue, 90 feet high. I forgot what that is in meters, by the way, but anyway, it's tall. Power. The whole machinery of the state is assembled. The prefects, satraps, prefects, governors, councillors, they're all there. Peer pressure. And conformity. Everyone must obey, no exceptions. So those are the principles he's working with. Size, power, and conformity. Now here's a question. Today, do we see trust in size, power, and conformity in our society, in our church? These are questions, right, not statements. And if so, what should be our response as true believers when we're confronted with size, power, and conformity, which might challenge our principles? Have a chat about that, can you? Just 2 or 3 minutes. Speak your mind and your convictions, and then we'll get some feedback from you. So, once again, an excited buzz going around the entire tent, all right? Okay. Okay. Our time is going, so we have about 5 minutes or so, and I'd just like to get some feedback from you. We've got a roving mic here. If you just put up your hand, if you can keep your comments brief, because we've only got about 5 minutes or so. Who would like to contribute to any thoughts or insights that you have on this topic? There's no peer pressure. You're not going to go into a furnace or anything like that.
I'm just seeing society moving away from the Word of God. Mm-hmm. And I think being PC, we may fall into that trap of wanting conformity, which would give us the power that we want. As a church, would maybe be a danger.
Okay, so the issue of like being politically correct and not being able to speak one's mind on matters which may be central to Christian faith, because you don't do that in polite society. Yes, okay. Yes.
Hello, yeah, I just have a question, slightly unrelated, but I'm just wondering, where was Daniel in this story?
Don't have a clue. Well, just very briefly in response, chapters 3 and 6 form two parallel chapters. And the interesting thing is that in chapter 3, his 3 friends are there, but not Daniel. In chapter 6, Daniel is there, but not his 3 friends. So you put the two together, but where is Daniel? I don't know, he's certainly not bowing down. I think we can be fairly certain of that. Okay, there's a question at the back here, yeah.
I'd just like to introduce Teresa, who told me her story. She was in communist Russia, and she was the only one of her family who stayed strong. They went off and conformed, and she had to make a choice. So we've got a living example here. Isn't that wonderful?
Yes, that's right. Good. And that kind of experience, well, it makes you humble when you meet people who have been through this kind of pressure, which many of us just haven't faced. So thank you for sharing that.
Where there was one power in Babylon, and that was King Nebuchadnezzar, we've got many different governments here, but there's going to be a time when all these governments will be of one opinion and making one law, and that's when we have got to stand faithful and true to our God and not bow down to what they want us to do.
Right. Yes, so thank you for that. So we can anticipate where there's going to be a big crisis, but if we haven't been faithful in the small things before that comes, in other words, we can't say once the big crisis comes, that's when I'm going to make my stand, because likely we won't.
I have a concern about this getting big and having power and all that. We've just recently seen within our church a system that is demanding the smaller churches to come under the dictatorship of the leadership of our church. And I'm sorry I have to say that today, but the point is that in this last year we were denied any financial assistance for outreach because we felt we could not come into conformity with this new natural church development system that the church was promoting.
Okay, now, clearly I can't comment on that directly because I don't know all of the details, but in general, of course, it's one thing for us to be aware of this problem in society, but we do need to be aware that we don't model ourselves on society as well. Although I can't comment on that specific thing that you mentioned because I don't know anything about that, but in principle that would be the case, I think. Any other comments? I think we have maybe 1 minute.
I hope my voice holds okay. In America, there's a lot of people who will resist the government. They want to bear arms, determine their own future, go off the grid, and they are suspicious of the government. But over here, I find most people are like sheep. And if the government says same-sex marriage is good, then everybody goes bow, bow. And if the government says we want everyone to be microchipped so they can buy and sell, everyone goes, oh, yes, government, yes, government. There's not the strong resistance against this dictatorship, authoritarian control. And I think we need to be a lot more vigilant that the government wants to impose these global reforms on us that are antichrist. Be aware.
Okay, thank you. Yes. So we live as Christians in an increasingly non-Christian world, and we need to live by principle. And I think this is, when we read these stories we're looking at in Daniel, it does enable us to see how do we live in a hostile world. It will help us to make decisions. Our time has gone, So thank you all for participating, and I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Thank you.